Imagine, it's the mid-1970s. You have a new neighbor who seems like he stepped out of a catalog. He's handsome, charming, intelligent, and well-dressed. He's a law student, volunteers at a crisis hotline, and even dabbles in politics. He's the kind of man your mother would love. He greets you with a perfect smile, helps carry your groceries, and seems genuinely concerned about the community's well-being. Meanwhile, the news is filled with terrifying stories of young women disappearing. A monster is on the loose. But it couldn't be him, of course. Not your perfect neighbor. But sometimes late at night you see him leaving in his Volkswagen Beetle. And occasionally you notice scratches on his hands, or a fleeting empty look in his eyes that doesn't match his smile. You aren't living next to a model citizen. You're living next to the definition of evil, hiding in plain sight. Today, we're ripping off the mask to show you why living next to Ted Bundy was to sleep next to a predator who hunted in his own backyard. And you most certainly would not survive it. Living next to Ted Bundy in the 1970s was to be the neighbor of a meticulously constructed illusion, a masterpiece of normalcy that concealed an abyss of depravity. To the outside world, and especially to those who shared a wall or a fence with him, Bundy was not just an ordinary man. He was the ideal of the good neighbor, the kind of person who anchors a community with his seemingly stable and reliable presence. He was the personification of the rising American dream, a young, articulate, and visibly intelligent law student whose political ambitions didn't seem out of reach. His participation in Republican campaigns and his volunteer work at a crisis hotline painted the portrait of a model citizen, someone genuinely invested in social welfare. He was not a dark recluse. On the contrary, he was sociable, approachable, and possessed a charisma that disarmed even the most skeptical. Imagine him offering to help carry your groceries, engaging in small talk about the weather or the government, always with a smile that seemed sincere and a gaze that conveyed trust. He was the kind of neighbor you would invite to a barbecue without a second thought, the man you would be happy to see your children look up to as an example of success and integrity. This facade was not just a mask, it was a weapon, forged with an almost supernatural understanding of human psychology and social expectations. He knew exactly which buttons to push to be perceived as harmless, as an ally, as part of the us and not the them. However, behind the curtain of this flawless performance, Bundy's daily routine, when observed more closely, began to reveal disturbing cracks. For a neighbor, Ted's life was a puzzle of subtle inconsistencies, small details that in isolation meant nothing, but which, taken together, wove a tapestry of strangeness. The comings and goings in his beige Volkswagen Beetle, for example, were erratic and frequently nocturnal. While the rest of the neighborhood slept, the headlights of his car could be seen cutting through the darkness, leaving for unknown destinations and returning at hours that defied any routine of a typical student or worker. There was also the obsessive care for his vehicle. It was not uncommon to see him cleaning the car's interior at peculiar times, scrubbing the upholstery with an intensity that seemed to go beyond simple maintenance. And what about the objects he carried? A more attentive neighbor might notice the constant presence of unusual items for a law student. A crowbar, ropes, or even a pair of crutches that appeared and disappeared without him ever seeming to have suffered any injury. The sounds that occasionally emanated from his residence were also dissonant. They weren't the noises of a party or a loud television, but rather dull, muffled thuds in the middle of the night, easily dismissed as a piece of furniture falling, but which, in retrospect, took on a sinister character. These were the red flags that the rational mind rushes to ignore, the small alarms that are silenced by the overwhelming force of his public persona. The true test of survival, however, would come in a direct encounter, a moment when the mask would slip for an instant, revealing the predator underneath. Imagine a casual meeting. He approaches with his characteristic smile, perhaps to ask for a cup of sugar or to comment on a local news story. The conversation is pleasant, he is charming, but then you notice it. You notice the look in his eyes, Behind the friendliness there is a vacuum, a calculating coldness that doesn't match the smile. His eyes don't connect. They assess, they measure, like a hunter observing its prey. The smile, when examined closely, doesn't reach the corners of his eyes, becoming a mere mechanical exercise of facial muscles. In that instant, a shiver runs down your spine, a primitive alarm that screams that something is fundamentally wrong. He might extend his hand for a shake, and the grip is firm, but the feeling that remains is one of a frigid disconnection, as if you were interacting not with a person, but with a perfect imitation of one. It is in this moment that cognitive dissonance sets in. The mind struggles to reconcile the charming man everyone sees with the visceral sense of danger he emanates. You would walk away from the interaction feeling uneasy, perhaps even a little foolish for your suspicion. After all, he's Ted, the perfect neighbor. But that unsettling feeling would be your survival instinct desperately trying to tell you that the monster haunting the news doesn't live in a distant castle, but shares your zip code. The carefully curated image of the perfect neighbor was a stage, and behind the curtain, a horrifying play was unfolding, written in blood and terror. The moment the mask truly drops is not with a single dramatic reveal, but in the chilling realization that the abstract horror on the nightly news has a concrete source, and that source is the man next door. To understand the sheer terror of living beside Ted Bundy, one must confront the brutal reality of his actions, starting with the crimes that would come to define his legacy of evil. While his reign of terror spanned multiple states and dozens of victims, the events at Lake Sammamish State Park on July 14, 1974, serve as a terrifyingly emblematic microcosm of his methods. On that bright, sunny day, amidst crowds of families and sunbathers, Bundy approached multiple young women. He wore a cast on his arm, a prop in his twisted theater, asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. It was a masterful exploitation of empathy. Janice Ott, a 23-year-old probation officer, took the bait and followed him to his Volkswagen. She was never seen alive again. Astonishingly, just a few hours later, Bundy returned to the same park and used the same ruse. This time he ensnared Denise Naslund, a 19-year-old who had been picnicking with friends. Two women vanished from a crowded public space in broad daylight. This was not a crime of passion or a random act of violence. It was a calculated predatory hunt. The audacity was breathtaking. He was a shark swimming among unsuspecting beachgoers, his friendly demeanor the perfect camouflage. For a neighbor, the news reports of these disappearances would have been deeply unsettling, a sign that the monster was getting bolder, closer. But the connection would still seem impossible. The man who just yesterday might have waved hello was methodically luring, abducting, and murdering women just a few miles away, operating with a chilling efficiency that defied comprehension. This emblematic crime was not an anomaly. It was the product of a refined and terrifying modus operandi. Bundy was a creature of pattern and ritual, a predator who honed his craft with each kill. His selection process was chillingly specific. He targeted young, attractive women, typically with long hair parted in the middle, a characteristic that some investigators believe mirrored a former girlfriend who had broken his heart. But his method of approach was his true signature, a symphony of manipulation. He was a chameleon, adapting his persona to fit the situation. He would feign injury, using a cast or crutches to appear vulnerable and non-threatening. He would impersonate authority figures, flashing a fake badge and identifying himself as a police officer to command compliance. He would use his charm and intelligence to engage potential victims in conversation, disarming them with his seemingly harmless nature before luring them to his vehicle. The Volkswagen Beetle, that symbol of counterculture innocence, was his rolling death trap. Once inside, the victim's fate was sealed. The passenger side door handle had been removed, and the seat was often missing, forcing the victim onto the floor, out of sight. He would then subdue them, often with a crowbar, before transporting them to a secluded secondary location, where he would subject them to unimaginable horrors. before ultimately ending their lives. This systematic approach reveals a mind that was not chaotic or out of control, but rather terrifyingly organized and disciplined in its pursuit of evil. He was a hunter, and his hunting grounds were the everyday places of the world: college campuses, shopping malls, and state parks. The very normality of his chosen locations made the threat all the more pervasive and insidious. This is where the horror becomes personal and immediate for the hypothetical neighbor. The abstract fear broadcast on television begins to bleed into reality, staining the mundane interactions of daily life. Imagine hearing the news report. Another young woman has vanished, last seen talking to a handsome man with his arm in a sling. A jolt of unease strikes you. You remember seeing Ted a few weeks ago, his arm in a cast, complaining about a supposed ski injury. You dismissed it then, but now the memory feels tainted, sinister. While the city is gripped by panic and police desperately search for clues, you notice your neighbor, Ted Bundy, in his driveway at 3 in the morning, meticulously scrubbing the carpets of his Volkswagen. The acrid smell of chemical cleaners hangs in the air, a smell you might have previously ignored, but which now seems to be masking something far more foul. You see him carrying heavy, oddly shaped garbage bags to the curb on trash day, bags that seem too heavy for ordinary household waste. You might even recall a fleeting glimpse of something in the back of his car. Was it a blanket, or was there something underneath it? Each news bulletin about a missing person becomes a potential clue, a piece of a puzzle you are terrified to solve. The friendly good morning he offers feels different now. It's the greeting of a man leading a double life of unimaginable darkness. The terror is no longer about a monster out there. It's about the chilling possibility that the evidence of his crimes, a blood stain, a strand of hair, a forgotten piece of jewelry, is just a few feet away, hidden behind a door you pass every single day. Living next to Ted Bundy was to be an unwitting spectator to the aftermath of his atrocities. Where the mundane chores of a neighbor were, in reality, the chilling act of erasing the evidence of a murder. The horror of Ted Bundy wasn't confined to the gruesome details of his crimes. It metastasized, infecting the very fabric of the communities he inhabited. The danger of living next to him wasn't just the physical proximity to a predator, but the psychological prison he built around everyone. This prison was fortified by a terrifying reality. The systems designed to protect you were often powerless, blind, or simply outmaneuvered by a man who understood their weaknesses better than they did. Bundy's reign of fear was amplified by his almost supernatural ability to slip through the fingers of law enforcement. This wasn't a simple case of a clever criminal. It was a systemic failure on a grand scale. A failure that left ordinary citizens feeling utterly exposed. A key reason for this was the pre-digital, fragmented nature of policing in the 1970s. Jurisdictions rarely communicated effectively. A string of disappearances in Washington might as well have been happening on another planet to investigators in Utah or Colorado. Bundy exploited this lack of connectivity masterfully, turning state lines into shields. He was a ghost, leaving a trail of sorrow in one state before rematerializing as a charming law student in another, always one step ahead of the disparate agencies trying to piece together the puzzle. His intelligence and legal training gave him another insidious advantage. When he was stopped or questioned, he wasn't a stammering, nervous suspect. He was calm, articulate, and confident. He knew his rights, and he knew how to project an aura of cooperative indignation. The perfect portrait of an innocent man wrongly hassled by overzealous cops. This performance was often enough to placate officers conducting routine traffic stops or preliminary inquiries. He looked the part of a respectable citizen so perfectly that he weaponized the biases of the very people meant to catch him. They were looking for a monster, a deviant lurking in the shadows, not a well-dressed, handsome, aspiring lawyer who could discuss legal theory with them. This created a force field of credibility around him. For a neighbor, this reality was the source of a particularly chilling form of despair. Imagine mustering the courage to report the strange late-night activities, the unsettling encounter, or the odd items in his car. You make the call, and perhaps a patrol car even swings by. They have a brief, pleasant chat with your charming neighbor, who easily explains everything away. The car leaves, and now you're left alone next door to a man who knows you suspected him. The system didn't just fail to catch him. It actively validated his facade, leaving you, the potential witness, isolated and marked. The chilling message was clear. The authorities couldn't save you. You were on your own. This powerlessness bred a pervasive climate of fear that seeped into the very soul of the community. The disappearances were no longer isolated tragedies. They were a constant, ambient threat that altered the rhythms of daily life. Streets that were once safe for an evening stroll became fraught with peril. The simple act of a woman walking to her car at night became a heart-pounding ordeal. A friendly stranger offering help was no longer a sign of kindness, but a potential death sentence. This collective anxiety created an unspoken code of conduct among neighbors, a fortress mentality built on suspicion and silence. The easy camaraderie of the neighborhood would evaporate, replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. People hurried from their cars to their front doors, eyes darting into the shadows. Curtains would twitch, but no one would speak up. The fear was twofold: fear of the unknown predator, and the equally potent fear of the known neighbor. To voice suspicion against the perfect Ted Bundy was to risk being ostracized as paranoid, or, worse, to draw his cold, calculating attention directly to your doorstep. This created a conspiracy of silence, not of malice, but of self-preservation. It was the unspoken rule of don't see, don't hear, don't speak. You might notice that the young woman who visited him last week never seemed to leave, but you tell yourself she must have left when you weren't looking. You hear a muffled scream in the night, but you convince yourself it was just a television or teenagers messing around. To acknowledge the truth was to accept a responsibility too terrifying to bear. Denouncing him wouldn't bring a SWAT team to your rescue. It would in all likelihood bring a polite, smiling Ted to your door the next day, asking to borrow a tool, his eyes holding a new, chilling glint of knowledge. This silence was his greatest ally. It allowed him to operate with impunity, cocooned by the fear he himself had created. The media's portrayal of the case only amplified this confusion and terror. In the initial stages, the reports were about a shadowy figure, a phantom killer. But as Bundy became a suspect, and especially during his trials, a bizarre and dangerous narrative began to form. He was the dapper dawn of serial killers, the campus killer who was brilliant and handsome. Some media coverage, and indeed some members of the public, seemed morbidly fascinated, almost captivated by his charm. This conflicting public perception made the situation even more perilous for those living nearby. The man the news was tentatively labeling a monster was also being described as a charismatic genius, creating a disorienting funhouse mirror effect. Was he a killer or a victim of a colossal mistake? This public ambiguity meant that your personal, gut-wrenching fear wasn't validated. It was questioned, making you doubt your own sanity. Living next to Ted Bundy was to be trapped in a psychological twilight zone, where your instincts screamed danger, but the world, the authorities, and even the media seemed to be under the spell of the very man who was the source of your terror. Every empire, no matter how terrifying or seemingly invincible, is built on a foundation with a fatal flaw. For Ted Bundy, an empire built on a god complex and meticulous planning, the crack that would ultimately shatter his world was his own ravenous ego. The fall of Ted Bundy was not the result of a single brilliant detective's masterstroke, but rather a slow, grinding process of his own arrogance colliding with the mundane reality of police work. The first significant blow to his phantom-like existence came from a place of simple, almost banal police procedure. In August 1975, in a suburb of Salt Lake City, a patrol officer named Bob Hayward noticed a Volkswagen Beetle lurking in a residential neighborhood in the early hours of the morning. When the officer turned on his lights, the Beetle sped off, leading to a high-speed chase. The driver was, of course, Ted Bundy. When finally apprehended, a search of his car revealed a chilling collection of items that had no place in a law student's vehicle: a crowbar, a face mask, rope, and handcuffs. This was the first time the physical tools of his trade were officially documented. It was his ego that led him to flee. A truly cautious man might have bluffed his way through the stop, but Bundy's instinct was to defy the authority that dared to challenge him. This traffic stop was the first thread pulled from the tapestry of his carefully woven anonymity. It placed him on law enforcement's radar in Utah and crucially, led to his eventual identification by Carol Duranche, a woman who had miraculously survived one of his abduction attempts. His mistake was returning to his hunting grounds, believing his own myth of invincibility. He was convicted of kidnapping, and for the first time, the monster was caged. However, the cage would not hold him for long, and his next acts of defiance would be his most dramatic, fueled by a desperate and narcissistic belief that he was smarter than everyone else. While imprisoned in Colorado to face murder charges, Bundy, acting as his own lawyer, the ultimate act of legal hubris, was granted access to the courthouse law library. During a recess, he asked to open a window for some fresh air, and in a stunningly bold move, leaped from the second story and escaped. He was on the run for 6 days before being recaptured, a pathetic and disheveled version of his former self. But his ego was not broken. 6 months later, he executed a far more elaborate escape. Over several weeks, he had painstakingly sawed a hole in the ceiling of his cell, crawling through the crawl space and out to freedom. This was not just an escape. It was a declaration of his superiority. He believed he was untouchable, a ghost who could not be chained. This escape, however, would be his undoing. Instead of disappearing into obscurity, his ego and his insatiable compulsions drove him east to Florida. There, his rage and desperation culminated in his most savage and chaotic crimes: the brutal attack on 4 women in the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, leaving 2 dead, and the abduction and murder of a 12-year-old girl, Kimberly Leach. These final frenzied acts lacked the meticulous planning of his earlier crimes. They were the work of a man unraveling, his mask not just dropped but shattered. His capture was as ignominious as his crimes were heinous. He was stopped by a Pensacola police officer in a stolen car, a pathetic end to his grand delusions of being a criminal mastermind. He was no longer the charming law student, but a common car thief. The trials that followed were a global spectacle, a circus orchestrated by Bundy himself. He once again chose to represent himself, turning the courtroom into his final stage. The contrast between the man he was and the man he pretended to be was never more stark. There he stood, accused of the most horrific acts imaginable. Yet he performed for the cameras, smiling, posturing, and cross-examining witnesses with a chilling detachment. He was the charming predator, the intelligent monster all at once. The world watched, captivated and horrified as the evidence mounted. The most damning moment came from the testimony of the Chi Omega survivors and, most scientifically, from the bite marks left on the body of one of the victims, Lisa Levy. In a moment of supreme forensic drama, dental experts matched the savage marks to Bundy's own crooked teeth. It was his signature, written in flesh, an undeniable link between the charming man in the courtroom and the vicious animal who had committed the crime. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. The powerful, untouchable figure was now just a man in a jumpsuit, stripped of his power, his freedom, and his future. His final days on death row were a pathetic coda to a life of manufactured grandeur. The master manipulator spent his last years trying to bargain for his life, offering to confess to other murders in exchange for a stay of execution. He became a subject of study for FBI profilers, a lab rat dissecting his own evil for an audience he still craved. The charm was gone, replaced by the desperate pleas of a man facing his own mortality. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair. The man who had thrived on exerting the ultimate power over others, the power of life and death, finally had that power turned against him. Outside the prison, crowds gathered celebrating his demise. It was a cathartic, almost primal release for a public that had been terrorized by his actions for over a decade. But even with his death, the questions lingered, hanging in the air like ghosts. Was his execution justice for his victims? Or was it merely the final consequence of his own destructive path? The fear he had created did not simply vanish with the flick of a switch. It left deep, permanent scars on the psyche of a nation. A chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those who look like monsters, but those who look just like us. Living next to Ted Bundy was a brutal lesson in the nature of evil. It rarely announces itself with monstrous features. More often than not, it smiles, offers a helping hand, and says good morning. Bundy's story is a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous predators are those who have mastered the art of blending in, using our own expectations of normalcy as their most effective weapon. He wasn't just a killer. He was a void disguised as a man, reflecting back the charm and trust people wanted to see. The terror he created wasn't just in the act of murder, but in the shattering of our most basic sense of safety and judgment. Stories like this force us to look beyond the surface and question the faces we think we know. If you are also fascinated by the darkest corners of the human psyche and want to continue exploring these complex figures, join our community of truth seekers by subscribing to the channel. And while Bundy's evil was a solitary hunt that terrorized communities from the outside, what happens when the monster isn't your neighbor but your leader? What happens when the danger isn't hiding next door, but inside a community you willingly joined? Seeking paradise. Imagine a place where everyone is your brother and sister. A charismatic leader promises you a world free from racism, inequality, and poverty. A true utopia on Earth. He seems to be a miracle worker, a savior who has all the answers in a world full of questions. You give him your loyalty, your money, your life, believing you are part of something special, a movement that will change the world. But slowly, paradise begins to feel like a prison. The love turns to fear, the community to a cult, and the promise of a better life begins to sound like a death sentence. In our next video, we will explore why you wouldn't have survived the most infamous cult in history. Click here to discover the chilling story of Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre.